In Greenridge, a Christmas parade turns controversial when Santa ignores a little black girl, Kayla Johnson. What follows is a journey of redemption, representation, and the true meaning of Christmas as Kayla takes on the role of Santa, changing her town forever. Write in the comment where you're watching this video from. The small town of Greenridge had always prided itself on its annual Christmas parade. Each December, the streets would come alive with the glow of twinkling lights, the scent of roasted chestnuts wafting through the air, and the excited chatter of children bundled in scarves and mittens. For decades, the parade had been a cherished tradition, bringing together families to celebrate the season with a spectacle of floats, music, and the grand finale, Santa Claus. Frank Reynolds had played the role of Santa for over 20 years. To the children of Greenridge, he was as much a fixture of Christmas as the towering spruce in the town square. Dressed in a plush red suit with a snowy white beard, Frank would wave to the crowds from atop his elaborately decorated sleigh, his deep "ho ho ho" ringing out over the festive commotion. Parents cheered, children squealed with delight, and Frank soaked in the admiration like a sponge. This year's parade was no different, or so Frank thought. The day of the parade dawned crisp and cold, the streets lined with families eager to catch a glimpse of the festivities. Floats covered in garlands and blinking lights rolled down Main Street, their occupants tossing candy canes into the crowd. A brass band played a spirited rendition of Jingle Bells, and groups of carolers followed, their harmonies echoing through the air. Frank sat in his sleigh near the end of the procession, the clop of the horses pulling him forward mingling with the cheers of the crowd. He waved to the children lining the sidewalks, his gloved hand moving rhythmically back and forth. He knew this routine well: wave, smile, bellow a hearty laugh. It was second nature by now, and he relished the attention. Near the midpoint of the parade route, Frank's sleigh approached a small family standing near the corner of Maple and 3rd. A little black girl, no older than 7, stood at the edge of the curb, her eyes wide with excitement. She wore a puffy pink jacket and a sparkly Santa hat that glittered in the sunlight. In her tiny hand, she clutched a handmade sign that read, "Dear Santa, I've been good. Santa, Santa," the girl called, jumping up and down, her sign bobbing with her. Her joy was infectious, drawing smiles from the people around her. But Frank barely spared her a glance. His eyes slid over her as if she weren't there, his gaze moving to the next cluster of waving children. He lifted his hand in a half-hearted wave to the larger group, completely ignoring the little girl's outstretched arm and shining face. The moment passed quickly for Frank, lost in the blur of the parade. But for Kayla, the little girl, it was as if the world had stopped. Her smile faltered, her arm dropping to her side as confusion flickered across her face. She looked around, as if expecting someone to explain why Santa had passed her by. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering softly, but the hurt in Kayla's eyes was undeniable. A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. Several adults exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from puzzled to disapproving. A man standing near Kayla's family pulled out his phone, capturing the scene in a short video that would later set off a wave of outrage on social media. "Did he just ignore her?" a woman whispered to her friend. "Maybe he didn't see her," another replied, though her tone was uncertain. Frank, oblivious to the growing whispers, continued down the parade route, his attention firmly fixed on the larger clusters of children waving enthusiastically. To him, it was just another successful year in the books. That evening, as the sun set over Greenridge and families returned home, Kayla sat quietly in her living room. Her sparkly Santa hat lay forgotten on the armrest of the couch, her handmade sign crumpled beside it. Her parents, Angela and David, tried to cheer her up with hot cocoa and Christmas music, but the sparkle in Kayla's eyes had dimmed. "Maybe he was just really busy," Angela said gently, brushing a curl away from Kayla's face. "Sometimes Santa has a lot to think about during the parade." Kayla looked up at her mother, her brow furrowed. "But he waved at everyone else." Angela's chest tightened. "I know, sweetie, but don't let it ruin your Christmas. Santa still cares about you. He's probably just tired from the parade." David placed a hand on Angela's shoulder, sharing a look of quiet frustration. They both knew that Kayla had been ignored, and though they couldn't say why, the sting of the moment was impossible to deny. Meanwhile, Frank returned to his modest home on the outskirts of town, pleased with how the day had gone. He poured himself a glass of eggnog and settled into his recliner, replaying the parade in his mind. To him, it had been another flawless performance. He had waved, he had laughed, and he had made the children of Greenridge happy, or so he thought. Frank's phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling his attention away from the television. He picked it up to find a message from a friend, accompanied by a link. "Have you seen this?" the message read. Frank clicked on the link, his brow furrowing as a video began to play. It was a clip from the parade, showing a little black girl waving excitedly at Santa. The camera zoomed in on her sign, the words "Dear Santa, I've been good," clear as day. But as the sleigh passed, Santa's gaze moved right over her, his hand barely lifting in acknowledgement before shifting to a larger group of children nearby. The video cut to Kayla's face, her smile fading as she lowered her sign. The clip was only a few seconds long, but its impact was immediate. Frank's stomach sank as he read the caption below. "When Santa ignores your little girl. Not so merry, huh?" The comments beneath the video were already piling up, a mix of outrage and speculation. "This is heartbreaking," one user wrote. "That little girl deserved better. Santa needs to take a good look at himself," another added. Frank's grip on the phone tightened, his face growing hot. He tossed it onto the table, muttering to himself. People are so quick to judge. They don't know what it's like out there. But deep down, the image of Kayla's face lingered in his mind. For the first time, Frank wondered if he had made a mistake. By the next morning, the small town of Greenridge buzzed with tension. Social media, usually filled with cheerful holiday photos and neighborhood updates, was ablaze with discussions about the Christmas parade and, more specifically, Santa Claus. The video of Frank ignoring Kayla had spread quickly, accompanied by captions that ranged from saddened observations to outright accusations. At the town's busiest cafe, locals huddled over steaming mugs of coffee, their conversations quiet but intense. The normally light-hearted chatter had been replaced by speculation and concern. "Did you see it?" asked Margaret, a retired schoolteacher, as she stirred her tea. "That poor girl. She looked so hurt." "I don't know," replied Tom, a long-time resident. "Frank's been Santa for years. Maybe it was just a mistake." Margaret shook her head. "You can't ignore something like that, Tom. That little girl was right in front of him, waving her heart out." "I'm sure he didn't mean it," Tom muttered, though his tone held uncertainty. At another table, two mothers spoke in hushed tones as their children colored on placemats. "It's not a good look for the town," said Laura, adjusting her scarf. "Santa's supposed to represent everyone, isn't he?" "Of course," replied her friend Kim. "But do you think it's fair to judge him on one moment?" "I think it's fair to ask why it happened," Laura said firmly, "and what we're going to do about it." At Kayla's house, the morning was unusually quiet. Normally, Kayla would have woken her parents early to talk about Christmas, her voice bubbling with excitement about the decorations and presents she hoped Santa would bring. But today, she sat at the kitchen table, her cereal untouched. Her sparkly Santa hat, usually her favorite accessory, lay discarded on the counter. Angela, her mother, sat across from her, trying to coax a smile from her daughter. "Maybe Santa didn't see you, honey," she said gently, though even she didn't believe her own words. There were so many people there. Kayla's small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "But he waved at everyone else," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. Angela exchanged a worried glance with her husband, David, who stood near the sink. He set down the dish he was drying and walked over, kneeling beside Kayla. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," he said. "Even Santa." Kayla's brow furrowed. "But Santa's supposed to be nice to everyone." "He is," David said, his tone soft. "And you know what? If he didn't do the right thing yesterday, maybe he'll find a way to make it better." Kayla didn't respond. She stared down at her cereal, pushing the pieces around with her spoon. Angela reached over, brushing a curl away from her daughter's face. "Don't let this ruin Christmas for you, sweetheart. You're too special to let one moment take away your joy." Kayla gave a small nod, but her parents could see the hurt lingering in her eyes. As the school bus honked from the corner, David placed a hand on Angela's shoulder. "I'll talk to her teacher," he said quietly, "just in case." As the door closed behind Kayla, Angela let out a long sigh. "Something has to be done," she said. Across town, Frank sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. It had been buzzing nonstop since last night, the notifications piling up with messages, calls, and emails. He had ignored most of them, too overwhelmed to respond. But curiosity finally got the better of him, and he opened the video link a friend had sent. The short clip showed Kayla, her sparkly Santa hat catching the light as she waved her sign enthusiastically. Frank's sleigh came into view, and the camera zoomed in on him. He lifted his hand, but instead of waving at Kayla, his eyes slid over her, his attention shifting to a larger group of children nearby. The camera panned back to Kayla, capturing the moment her smile faded and her sign dropped to her side. Frank felt his stomach twist as he read the caption. "When Santa ignores your little girl. Not so merry, huh?" The comments below were relentless. "This is heartbreaking. That poor kid. Santa shouldn't be selective about who he waves at. Time for Greenridge to rethink who they let play Santa." Frank tossed the phone onto the table, his face hot with frustration. "People are so quick to judge," he muttered to himself. "They don't know how hard it is out there." Still, the image of Kayla's face lingered in his mind. For the first time, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. The town council gathered for an emergency meeting later that morning, the video having reached their inboxes as well. Mayor Linda Harper sat at the head of the table, her usually calm demeanor tinged with concern. "This video has caused quite a stir," she began, her voice measured. "Greenridge prides itself on being a welcoming community. But this is making people question that." Councilmember Clara leaned forward. "It's not just about the video," she said. "This is about what kind of message we're sending. Santa Claus is supposed to represent joy and kindness for everyone. If people feel excluded, then we've failed." Another member, Paul, frowned. "Frank's been Santa for over 20 years. Are we really ready to replace him over one incident?" Linda tapped her pen on the table, her gaze steady. "It's not just about replacing him. It's about what the role of Santa means. We need to show the community, and especially our kids, that everyone deserves to be seen and celebrated." Clara nodded. "I think we all agree that it's time for a change." Paul hesitated. "Who would even take his place? We can't just pull someone out of thin air." Linda smiled faintly. "We already have someone in mind. Someone who represents everything Santa should be." The council exchanged curious glances as Linda continued. "Kayla Johnson." A murmur rippled through the room. Clara smiled approvingly, while others looked surprised but intrigued. Paul raised an eyebrow. "The little girl from the video?" "Exactly," Linda said. "She's everything we want Santa to be. Kind, spirited, and full of hope. What better way to show Greenridge's commitment to inclusivity?" The decision was unanimous. That afternoon, Frank answered a knock at his door to find Mayor Harper standing on his porch. Her expression was calm but firm, and Frank's heart sank. "Linda," he said, forcing a smile. "Good to see you. I was hoping you'd come by to sort out this mess." She stepped inside, taking a seat in his living room. Frank offered her coffee, but she waved it off, getting straight to the point. "Frank, we've decided to make a change for next year's parade." Frank blinked. "A change?" "We're appointing a new Santa," she said gently. "It's time for a fresh start." Frank's jaw tightened, his face reddening. "You're replacing me? After everything I've done for this town?" "This isn't personal," Linda said. "But we need to show the community that we're listening. People are upset, Frank. We can't ignore that." Frank leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "You're throwing me under the bus for one mistake?" after 20 years. It's not about the mistake, Linda said. It's about the bigger picture. And we've already chosen your replacement. Frank froze. Who? Linda's gaze didn't waver. Kayla Johnson. For a moment, Frank couldn't speak. His mind raced, his emotions swinging wildly between disbelief and anger. You're replacing me with a little girl? Linda stood, her expression unwavering. She's everything Santa should be. And it's time we showed that Santa isn't about one person. It's about what they represent. As she left, Frank sat in stunned silence. The words echoed in his mind. Kayla Johnson, your replacement. Frank Reynolds stared out his living room window, watching the quiet snow settle over Greenridge. It had been 2 days since Mayor Harper's visit, and her words still echoed in his mind. We're appointing a new Santa, Kayla Johnson. He shook his head, unable to make sense of it. Replacing him with a little girl? It was insulting. Santa was supposed to be jolly, authoritative, larger than life. How could a child fill those boots? He thought back to the parade. The video, the backlash, the accusations. It all felt so unfair. With a sigh, Frank walked to the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee. The bitterness of it matched his mood. He'd been Santa for over 2 decades. Every year, families cheered for him. Parents brought their kids to wave at him on the float, to sit on his lap at the tree lighting ceremony. He wasn't just playing Santa, he was Santa. And now it felt like the town had tossed him aside without a second thought. By midday, Frank decided to leave the house. Staying cooped up only fueled his frustration, and he hoped the fresh air would help clear his head. He drove into town, the familiar streets lined with holiday decorations. Garlands wrapped around lampposts, wreaths hanging from storefront doors, and twinkling lights strung above the main square. As Frank parked near the diner, he noticed people glancing his way. A few offered polite nods, but others quickly averted their eyes. It was subtle, but Frank felt it. The shift in how the town saw him. Where there had once been warmth and respect, there was now awkwardness, even judgment. Inside the diner, the usual hum of conversation seemed to hush as Frank stepped through the door. He ignored the whispers and headed for the counter, taking a seat at the far end. The waitress, a young woman named Lily, approached hesitantly. "Coffee, Frank?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "Yeah, thanks," he muttered. As Lily poured his coffee, Frank overheard snippets of conversation from the other tables. He just ignored her, right there in front of everyone. "I heard they've already replaced him. Serves him right." Frank's grip tightened on his mug, his jaw clenching. He wanted to stand up and shout, to defend himself, to tell them they didn't understand. Instead, he stared into his coffee, the heat of the cup doing little to melt the cold knot in his chest. Later that afternoon, Frank returned home and sat on the couch, staring at his phone. Messages continued to pour in, some supportive but most critical. His longtime friend Dave had called twice, leaving voicemails urging him to ride this out and let the dust settle. But Frank wasn't sure there was any dust left to settle. Unable to resist, he opened Facebook. The town's community page was flooded with posts about the parade. Most of them were about Kayla's moment with Santa, or, more specifically, the lack of it. Frank scrolled past photos and comments, his heart sinking as he read the words. Every kid deserves to feel seen. How can we trust someone like that to represent the spirit of Christmas? It's time for Greenridge to do better. One post caught his attention. It was from Kayla's mother, Angela. She had shared a photo of Kayla sitting by the Christmas tree, her sparkly Santa hat perched on her lap. The caption read, "She still believes in the magic of Christmas, but it broke my heart to see her doubt it, even for a moment." Frank stared at the photo, his chest tightening. Kayla's face was a mix of hope and lingering sadness, her small hands clutching the hat like it was a lifeline. He looked away, guilt flickering at the edges of his mind. But then another thought crept in. I didn't do anything wrong. The next morning, Frank decided to visit his friend Dave. If anyone could help him make sense of the situation, it was Dave, who had always been the voice of reason in Frank's life. The two men sat in Dave's garage, the smell of sawdust and motor oil filling the air as they worked on an old woodworking project. "This whole thing is ridiculous," Frank said, sanding a piece of pine. "One moment, one kid, and now the whole town's acting like I'm some kind of villain." Dave nodded slowly. "It's not fair, I'll give you that, but people are upset, Frank. They saw that video, and it didn't look good." Frank set down the sandpaper, his voice rising. "I didn't ignore her on purpose. Do you know how chaotic it is up there on that float? You've got kids waving from every direction, parents yelling, cameras flashing. It's impossible to focus on everyone." "I get that," Dave said calmly. "But did you even notice her?" Frank hesitated, his mind replaying the moment. He remembered the parade, the crowd, the sea of faces. He remembered waving, laughing, doing his usual routine. But Kayla's face, her sparkly hat, her sign, he couldn't recall. "I was busy," Frank said finally, his voice quieter. "It wasn't intentional." Dave nodded again. "Maybe not. But intention doesn't always matter, Frank. What matters is how people feel." That little girl felt invisible. And whether you meant to or not, you were the reason. Frank looked away, the words hitting harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but something about Dave's tone stopped him. For the first time, Frank began to wonder if there was more to the story than he'd allowed himself to see. That evening, Frank sat alone in his living room, the house eerily quiet. He thought about Kayla, about the look on her face in the photo her mother had posted. He thought about the whispers at the diner, the comments online, the way people had started to look at him differently. And he thought about what Dave had said. Intention doesn't always matter. Frank rubbed his hands together, his mind racing. Was it possible that he'd let his own assumptions blind him? That he'd ignored someone who needed to feel the magic of Christmas because, in that moment, he hadn't thought she belonged in it? The realization was slow, creeping up on him like the cold seeping through the cracks of an old window. For years, Frank had prided himself on being the perfect Santa. But maybe being Santa wasn't about wearing the suit or shouting "ho ho ho" from a float. Maybe it was about something much bigger, something he'd failed to understand. For the first time in decades, Frank felt unsure of his place in Greenridge. And as the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something about it. While Frank wrestled with the fallout from the parade, Kayla Johnson's world was slowly shifting. In her small house on Elm Street, the days after the parade were marked by quiet conversations between her parents and an outpouring of support from neighbors and strangers alike. Angela and David Johnson had been overwhelmed by the response to the video. Cards and messages poured in, filled with words of encouragement for Kayla and their family. "Kayla's a bright star. Don't let anyone dim her light. Your little girl deserves to feel special, because she is. You're raising a future leader." At first, Angela had shielded Kayla from most of the attention, worried it would overwhelm her. But soon, she realized how much the community's kindness was lifting their daughter's spirits. Kayla began reading the cards herself, her smile growing a little wider with each one. One snowy afternoon, a knock at the door interrupted their quiet. Angela opened it to find Mayor Linda Harper standing on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around a large envelope to protect it from the cold. "Mayor Harper?" Angela said, surprised. "Mrs. Johnson," the mayor replied with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Come in." Angela stepped aside, ushering her inside. "Kayla's just in the living room." The mayor stepped into the cozy space, her gaze falling on Kayla, who was curled up on the couch with a book. Her sparkly Santa hat was perched on the armrest, its glitter catching the light from the Christmas tree. "Hi, Kayla," Linda said, kneeling slightly to meet the girl's eye level. "Do you mind if I talk to you and your parents for a moment?" Kayla glanced at her mom, who nodded reassuringly. She closed her book and sat up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. Linda took a deep breath, her tone gentle but purposeful. "Kayla, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at the parade. What you went through wasn't fair, and I want to make sure it never happens again. That's why I came here today, to ask for your help." Kayla tilted her head, confused. My help. Linda nodded. Next year, we want you to be Santa Claus at the parade. Kayla blinked, her small mouth forming an O of surprise. Me? Yes, you, Linda said, smiling. Santa isn't about what someone looks like. It's about the spirit they carry. The joy, the kindness, and the love they bring to others. You have all of that, Kayla. And I think you'd make a wonderful Santa. Angela and David exchanged shocked glances, their emotions swinging between pride and concern. Angela finally spoke. That's a very big offer, Mayor Harper. I know, Linda admitted, and I understand if it feels overwhelming. But I truly believe Kayla can do this. She represents everything Greenridge wants to be. A place where everyone is seen and celebrated. Angela crouched beside Kayla, searching her daughter's face. Sweetheart, how do you feel about this? It's a big responsibility. Kayla bit her lip, her brow furrowed in thought. Do you really think I can do it? She asked, looking at the mayor. I know you can, Linda replied, and we'll be here to help every step of the way. After a long pause, Kayla nodded slowly, a small smile spreading across her face. Okay, I'll do it. From that day forward, Kayla began preparing for her new role. The town council organized a series of events to introduce Kayla as the next Santa Claus, framing it as a celebration of Greenridge's commitment to inclusivity. Kayla, once shy about the spotlight, found herself growing more confident with each event. At a holiday market, she greeted children who ran up to her with wide eyes and even wider smiles. She listened as they told her what they wanted for Christmas, her laughter ringing out as she promised to pass their wishes along to the North Pole. At a tree-lighting ceremony, she helped flip the switch, the crowd cheering as the town square came alive with light. The attention wasn't always easy. Not everyone in Greenridge supported the change, and a few parents muttered about tradition and political correctness. Kayla overheard some of the comments, and though they stung, she didn't let them deter her. Her parents reminded her of why she had taken on this role, not to prove anything to the naysayers, but to bring joy and hope to the children who needed it most. One snowy evening, Angela found Kayla sitting at the dining table, surrounded by books and printouts about Santa Claus. She had been reading about the origins of the legend, from St. Nicholas to modern-day depictions of Santa. In front of her was a notebook filled with her careful handwriting. What's all this? Angela asked, pulling up a chair. I wanted to learn more about Santa, Kayla said, her eyes bright. If I'm going to be him, I want to do it right. Angela's chest swelled with pride. You're amazing, you know that? Kayla grinned. I just want everyone to have fun at the parade. I want them to feel happy. Angela reached over and squeezed her hand. They will, sweetheart, because you're putting your heart into this. As December approached, Kayla's excitement grew. The town council arranged for a special sleigh to be designed just for her, complete with cushions and steps to help her climb aboard. Volunteers decorated it with garlands, lights, and a banner that read, Greenridge's new Santa, Kayla Johnson. The night before the parade, Angela found Kayla sitting by the Christmas tree, holding her sparkly Santa hat. Her eyes were wide, and her expression was a mix of excitement and nerves. Big day tomorrow, Angela said, sitting beside her. Kayla nodded. What if I mess up? Angela wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You won't, and even if you do, it's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that you're doing something brave and beautiful. Kayla leaned into her mother, the warmth of the moment settling over her like a blanket. I'm gonna try my best. Angela smiled, pressing a kiss to her daughter's temple. That's all anyone could ask for. Frank Reynolds spent the days leading up to the Christmas parade in a haze of frustration and disbelief. The announcement of Kayla Johnson as the new Santa Claus had spread through Greenridge like wildfire, splashed across local newspapers, social media, and even the evening news. The responses were largely positive, but Frank couldn't help zeroing in on the voices of discontent, the ones lamenting the loss of tradition or calling the decision a step too far. 20 years, Frank muttered to himself as he paced the living room, the muffled sound of the television playing in the background. I gave them 20 years, And this is how they repay me? His words fell flat in the empty house. Outside, the snow fell in soft drifts, covering the world in quiet beauty, but Frank couldn't enjoy it. He felt like a relic, discarded and forgotten. The morning paper only deepened his bitterness. On the front page was a photo of Kayla sitting atop her custom sleigh, her sparkly Santa hat replaced with a plush red cap trimmed in white fur. Her grin stretched wide, her eyes glowing with pride as she waved to the camera. The headline read, "A New Era for Greenridge's Christmas Parade." Frank tossed the paper aside, the coffee in his mug growing cold as he stewed. He couldn't understand it. Why the town had chosen a little girl to replace him. Why they had turned their backs on someone who had dedicated decades to the role. And yet, beneath the layers of resentment, there was something else gnawing at him. A faint but persistent whisper of doubt. Had he done something wrong? He pushed the thought away. "I didn't ignore her on purpose," he said aloud, as if convincing himself. It wasn't personal. But the video replayed in his mind. The way his eyes had slid past Kayla, her sign bobbing in her small hands, her face lighting up before falling in disappointment. The image haunted him no matter how hard he tried to forget. A few days before the parade, Frank ventured into town for groceries. He kept his head down as he moved through the aisles, avoiding eye contact with other shoppers. The murmurs started as soon as he entered, subtle but unmistakable. "Isn't that Frank Reynolds? Used to be Santa, right?" "Yeah, until the whole thing with that girl." Frank gritted his teeth, gripping the handle of his cart tightly. He grabbed a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a few other items before heading to the checkout line. As he placed his items on the conveyor belt, he caught a snippet of conversation from the cashier and a customer. "I think it's great," the cashier was saying. "Kayla deserves it. She's such a sweet kid." The customer nodded. "And she's handling it so well. A lot of kids would have been scared to take on something like this, but she's just glowing." Frank felt a pang in his chest. He paid for his groceries and left the store quickly, his mind racing. That afternoon, Frank decided to drive past the community center where volunteers were preparing for the parade. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down he knew it was more than that. He wanted to see for himself, wanted to understand what everyone else seemed to see in Kayla that he couldn't. The parking lot was bustling with activity when he arrived. Trucks loaded with decorations and supplies rumbled in and out, while volunteers in colorful scarves and gloves carried boxes of ornaments and garlands into the building. In the center of it all was Kayla, her red coat standing out against the white snow as she directed a group of helpers. Frank stayed in his truck, watching as Kayla knelt beside a younger child who had dropped a box of candy canes. She helped the boy pick them up, her laughter ringing out as she handed him one. When another volunteer approached her with a question, Kayla answered with a confidence that seemed far beyond her years. Frank's chest tightened. For so long, he had thought of himself as irreplaceable, as the embodiment of Santa Claus in Greenridge. But watching Kayla, he realized something he hadn't been willing to admit. She had the spirit of Santa in a way he never had. It wasn't about the suit or the float or the loud, "Ho, ho, ho." It was about kindness, about connection, about making every child feel seen. Frank turned the key in the ignition, the rumble of the engine pulling him from his thoughts. He drove home in silence, the weight of his realization settling over him. That night, Frank sat in his recliner, staring at the twinkling lights of his Christmas tree. He thought about his years as Santa, the joy he had felt, the pride he had taken in the role. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had ever truly understood what it meant. Had he been playing a part or had he been living it? The question lingered as he drifted off to sleep, the whispers of doubt following him into his dreams. The next day, Frank made a decision. He dressed in his warmest coat and boots, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and drove back to the community center. This time, he parked and got out of the truck, the cold air biting at his cheeks as he walked toward the building. Inside, the volunteers were bustling about, their laughter and chatter filling the room. Frank spotted Kayla sitting at a table, carefully arranging ornaments in neat rows. Her parents stood nearby, chatting with Mayor Harper. Frank hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He had come here to see her, but now that he was standing in the doorway, he felt unsure. What could he say to make up for what had happened? How could he apologize for something he hadn't even realized he'd done? Before he could decide, Kayla looked up and saw him. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, Frank thought she might run away. But instead, she smiled. A small, hesitant smile that sent a pang of guilt straight through him. "Hi, Mr. Santa," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room. Frank took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Hi, Kayla," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Can we talk?" She nodded, setting down the ornament she had been holding. Her parents exchanged curious glances but didn't intervene. Frank crouched beside her, his knees protesting the movement. "I want to say I'm sorry," he began, his words slow and deliberate. "At the parade, I didn't see you. I should have. And I know I hurt you. That's not what Santa's supposed to do." Kayla tilted her head, studying him. "Why didn't you see me?" Frank hesitated, the question cutting deeper than he expected. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it wasn't because of you. It was because I wasn't paying attention the way I should have been." Kayla's small hand reached out, resting on his. "It's okay," she said. "I'm Santa now. I'll make sure to see everyone." Frank blinked, his throat tightening. "I know you will," he said, his voice thick. "You're going to be an amazing Santa, Kayla." She smiled, her confidence shining through. For the first time, Frank felt a sense of peace. Not because he had been forgiven, but because he had finally seen Kayla for who she truly was. Someone who embodied everything Santa should be. The day of the parade dawned bright and cold, the kind of crisp winter morning that seemed tailor-made for holiday cheer. Snow dusted the streets of Greenridge, the rooftops glistening under the pale sunlight. Along Main Street, families bundled in scarves and hats gathered early to claim their spots. Children clutched steaming cups of hot cocoa, their laughter rising above the cheerful carols playing over loudspeakers. The air was alive with anticipation. This year, the crowd was larger than ever. Word had spread about Kayla Johnson's debut as Santa Claus, and people from neighboring towns had come to see the historic moment. For many, it was more than just a parade. It was a symbol of change, of progress, of something new and hopeful. Back at the community center, Kayla stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the red velvet coat that had been tailored just for her. The white fur trim gleamed against the rich fabric, and the matching hat sat snugly atop her curls. She twirled in place, her reflection showing a mixture of excitement and nerves. "Do I look okay?" she asked, turning to her parents. Angela knelt beside her, fixing the fur on her sleeves. "You look perfect, sweetie. Just remember to smile and have fun. That's what this is all about." David crouched on her other side, holding her small gloved hands in his. "You've got this, Kayla. Just be yourself, and everyone will love you." Kayla nodded, her confidence growing. "Okay, I'm ready." Mayor Harper entered the room, her face lighting up at the sight of Kayla. "The sleigh is ready, and the crowd's waiting. Are you excited?" Kayla grinned, her nerves momentarily forgotten. "Yes." As the parade began, the floats rolled down Main Street one by one, each more elaborate than the last. There were candy-themed carriages, toy trains, and even a group of carolers dressed as gingerbread people. The crowd cheered and waved, their energy building with every passing moment. When Kayla's sleigh appeared at the end of the procession, a collective cheer erupted from the crowd. Pulled by a team of white horses adorned with silver bells, the sleigh sparkled with garlands of lights and ribbons. Sitting tall in the center, Kayla waved enthusiastically, her red-gloved hand moving back and forth as her voice rang out. "Merry Christmas! Ho, ho, ho!" Children squealed with delight, their faces lighting up as they pointed toward her. Kayla's heart swelled with happiness as she saw their excitement. She waved to every child she saw, making sure to meet their eyes and call out to them individually. "You're going to get everything you asked for," she said to a boy holding up a sign. "Your sweater is so pretty," she told a little girl wrapped in a glittery scarf. Her parents walked beside the sleigh, their smiles wide and proud. Angela glanced at David, tears shining in her eyes. "She's amazing," she whispered. "She always has been," David replied, his voice full of emotion. In the crowd, Frank stood off to the side, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat. He hadn't planned to come to the parade, but something had compelled him to see Kayla's debut for himself. As her sleigh passed, he felt a strange mix of emotions: pride, regret, and a deep sense of humility. He watched as Kayla leaned over the edge of the sleigh, waving to a small boy in a wheelchair. The boy's face lit up as Kayla shouted, "Merry Christmas! You're a star!" Frank's chest tightened. For so many years, he had thought of himself as irreplaceable, as the only one who could embody the spirit of Santa Claus. But seeing Kayla now, he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't just filling the role. She was redefining it. After the parade ended, the crowd dispersed, and volunteers began cleaning up the streets. Kayla's sleigh was parked near the community center, where she stood surrounded by excited children asking for autographs and pictures. Her parents watched from a distance, their pride shining brighter than the Christmas lights strung above. Frank lingered near the edge of the parking lot, unsure whether to approach. He had apologized to Kayla once, but he felt the weight of something unfinished. Summoning his courage, he walked toward her. Kayla noticed him immediately and smiled. "Hi, Mr. Santa," she called, her voice cheerful. Frank's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Hi, Kayla. You were amazing out there." "Thanks," Kayla replied, adjusting her hat. "Did you see all the kids? They were so happy." "I did," Frank said, his voice soft. "And they were happy because of you." Kayla tilted her head, sensing something serious in his tone. Frank crouched down to meet her gaze, his expression earnest. "Kayla," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I want to say thank you for being the Santa this town needed, and for showing me what it really means to be Santa. It's not about the suit or the sleigh. It's about the heart. And you've got more heart than anyone I've ever met." Kayla beamed, her smile as bright as the sun. "Thank you, Mr. Santa. That means a lot." Frank hesitated, then added, "And if you ever need help next year, carrying ornaments, holding the reins, anything, I'd be honored." Kayla's eyes widened. "You'd help me?" Frank nodded. "If you'll have me." Kayla reached out and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "Of course I will. You're still Santa too." The simple words hit Frank harder than he expected. He hugged her back, a lump forming in his throat. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he still had a place in the Christmas magic. That evening, as the sun set over Greenridge, the town was aglow with a sense of unity and joy. Families gathered for the tree-lighting ceremony, where Kayla flipped the switch, illuminating the towering spruce in the town square. The crowd cheered as carolers sang, their voices blending in perfect harmony. Frank stood near the back, watching as Kayla greeted the crowd with her signature warmth and enthusiasm. He no longer felt bitterness or resentment. Instead, he felt pride in Kayla, pride in his town, and pride in knowing that he had played a small role in something bigger than himself. The weeks following the Christmas parade brought a sense of profound change to Greenridge. Kayla's debut as Santa Claus had sparked conversations far beyond the town's borders. News outlets shared the story of the little black girl who had taken on the mantle of a cherished holiday figure, highlighting not only her courage but the town's decision to embrace inclusivity. Kayla's radiant image on her glittering sleigh became a symbol of what the holidays could mean in a world striving for greater equality. But within Greenridge, the ripple effects were more complex. The decision to make Kayla Santa had ignited conversations that many residents had avoided for years. In coffee shops, church basements, and living rooms, neighbors debated what the parade represented and who deserved to embody its central figure. At Kayla's school, the changes were immediate and unmistakable. Children who had never paid much attention to her now crowded around her at recess, eager to be her friend. Her teacher invited her to share her experiences as Santa during a special class discussion. where Kayla described the excitement of waving to kids and hearing their Christmas wishes. "But weren't you scared?" a boy named Caleb asked, his freckles scrunching as he furrowed his brow. Kayla thought for a moment. "A little," she admitted. "But my mom says being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you don't let the fear stop you." Her classmates nodded in admiration, but not everyone was so supportive. A few murmured behind her back, echoing the sentiments they'd overheard at home. "Santa's supposed to be a jolly old man, not a kid. It's just for attention. Everyone's acting like it's such a big deal." Kayla heard some of the comments and told her parents that night. Angela and David shared a look of quiet frustration before sitting down with their daughter. "Some people have a hard time accepting change," Angela explained, brushing a curl away from Kayla's face. "It doesn't mean what you're doing isn't important. It just means you're showing them something they weren't ready to see." David nodded. "You're teaching them that Santa isn't about being old or white or even a man. It's about bringing joy to everyone. And some people need a little longer to understand that." Kayla smiled faintly, their words comforting her. "So I'm like a teacher?" Angela grinned. "The best kind. You're teaching with kindness." While Kayla blossomed in her role, Frank Reynolds struggled with his own transformation. The days after the parade had been humbling, filled with uncomfortable truths about how he had approached his time as Santa. For years, he had carried himself with the unspoken belief that he embodied everything the role required. A commanding presence, a booming laugh, and a comforting familiarity for the children of Greenridge. But watching Kayla, he had come to realize how narrow his understanding had been. Frank thought often about his upbringing in Greenridge, a town where diversity had always been an afterthought. As a boy, he had learned to navigate life by following unspoken rules. Rules that told him who belonged where and what roles were meant for whom. He'd never questioned why Santa, a figure of myth and magic, had to look a certain way. It had simply been the way things were. But now, those assumptions felt like barriers he had never seen before. One snowy afternoon, as Frank repaired a float in his garage, a knock on the door interrupted his work. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to find Kayla and her parents standing on the porch. Kayla held a plate of cookies, her sparkly Santa hat perched atop her head. "Hi, Mr. Santa," Kayla said brightly, her smile as warm as ever. Frank blinked in surprise. "Kayla, what are you doing here?" "We wanted to thank you," Angela said, her voice gentle but firm, "for coming to the parade. It meant a lot to Kayla, and to us." Frank stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. He led them to a small table near the garage heater, where they sat surrounded by tools and scraps of wood. Kayla placed the cookies on the table, the smell of sugar and cinnamon filling the air. "I was nervous at the parade," Kayla admitted, her small hands resting on her lap. "But I saw you watching me, and it made me feel like I could do it." Frank's throat tightened. "You were incredible, Kayla. Better than I ever was." Kayla tilted her head. "But you were Santa for a long time. Doesn't that mean you were good at it, too?" Frank let out a soft laugh, his eyes glistening. "I thought I was, but I think I missed something important." Angela and David exchanged a glance, sensing the weight of his words. "What do you mean, Frank?" David asked. Frank sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "I spent so many years thinking Santa had to be, well, someone like me. Big, loud, the kind of person kids recognize from all the movies and books. But seeing you up there, Kayla, it made me realize Santa's not about that. It's about who can bring joy to everyone, no matter who they are." Kayla beamed, her pride shining through. "You can do that too, Mr. Santa. You just have to try." Frank smiled, reaching out to squeeze her small hand. "You're right, Kayla. I can try." Over the next few months, Frank began to integrate himself into the community in new ways. He volunteered at the food bank and joined a mentorship program that paired adults with local youth. At first, he felt out of place, unsure how to connect with the diverse group of kids. But he quickly realized that listening, really listening, was the key. One afternoon, as he sat with a group of teens discussing their goals, a young black boy named Jamal turned to him with a question. "Mr. Reynolds, do you think people can really change? Like, For real? Frank thought about the question for a long moment before answering. I think people can change if they're willing to learn. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if you open your heart and your mind, you can see the world in ways you never did before. Jamal nodded thoughtfully, his expression softening. I think I want to believe that. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, Greenridge felt like a different town. The parade planning committee had expanded to include residents from all parts of the community, ensuring that every voice was heard. Kayla, now a year older and even more confident, was ready to reprise her role as Santa Claus. This time she had a helper. On the day of the parade, Frank walked alongside her sleigh, wearing an elf costume and handing out candy canes to children along the route. He laughed heartily, his booming voice calling out greetings to the crowd. Kayla waved from the sleigh, her red-gloved hand moving in wide arcs as children shouted her name. Santa! Santa! Near the end of the route, Kayla leaned over the side of the sleigh. Mr. Santa, you're doing great. Frank grinned up at her, his eyes twinkling. Not as great as you, kiddo. The crowd roared with applause as the parade ended. The town square bathed in the glow of holiday lights. As families gathered for the tree-lighting ceremony, Frank stood beside Kayla, his heart full. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood the spirit of Christmas. Not as something to be owned or performed, but as something to be shared. That evening, as the festivities wound down, Kayla approached Frank with a small gift wrapped in shiny red paper. This is for you, she said, her voice soft. Frank opened the package to reveal a wooden ornament shaped like Santa Claus. Across the front, in Kayla's careful handwriting, were the words, "You'll always be Santa to me." Frank's throat tightened as he looked down at her. Thank you, Kayla. This means more than I can say. Kayla smiled, her eyes shining with warmth. Merry Christmas, Mr. Santa. Frank pulled her into a gentle hug, the past and present blending into something new and hopeful. For both of them, it was a Christmas they would never forget. A reminder that the holidays weren't just about tradition, but about the people who shaped them. As the snow fell softly over Greenridge, the town stood united in a way it never had before. And at the heart of it all was a little girl who had redefined what it meant to embody the spirit of Santa Claus.